I want to welcome you to the University of Chicago Center in Beijing. I know that some of you are alumni and some of you are students and other friends of the university, and you're all very welcome to be here this afternoon. My name is Beth Bader, and I'm the executive director of the center. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Paul Wong. Many of you probably already know Paul, but Paul is the president of the University of Chicago Beijing chapter of the Alumni Club.
I'm a graduate of law school, by the way. I got my first degree in '94, and LLM degree, and the second one, JSD, in 1999. And I'm very pleased that you can come. I enjoyed this wonderful lecture. And now we're in an electronic age, so I don't have a paper now. I use my iPhone to do the introduction. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Dan Slater. Professor Slater is associate professor in the Department of Political Science and associate member of the Department of Sociology at UChicago. And he is the author of Authoritarian Power, Contentious Politics, and Authoritarian, now this is the word I have difficulty with, Leviathan? Leviathan? Is that? Thank you. After all those years at Chicago, you know, I've stayed in the U.S. for 14 years, and you know, in Chicago at UChicago about 7 years, and practiced law there for about a couple of years, and I'm still, you know, having a problem with you know, pronunciation now. In Southeast Asia, and co-editor of Southeast Asia in political science, theory, religion, and qualitative analysis. He has published in numerous journals, including the American Journal of Political Science and the American Journal of Sociology, International Organization, and World Politics. So let's welcome Professor Slater.
Thanks so much to everybody for coming out on a Saturday to hear this talk. It's a real pleasure to be here in Beijing. So what I'm going to be talking about today is a book project that I'm working on with a co-author from the University of Toronto named Joseph Wong. And Joe, you might know some of his work, especially on Korea and Taiwan, looks at issues like health policy and the like. But so I work on Southeast Asia, Joe works on Northeast Asia, so that points to one of two caveats I want to make about the talk. So first caveat is that I'm primarily an expert on Indonesia and Malaysia, Southeast Asian politics. I'm not an expert on China. I will, however, be trying as much as I can to draw on examples from China, because I'm imagining it will be of most interest to people in the room. And so please forgive me if I am not exactly as expert as I should be on the Chinese case. Hopefully I can learn from you and your comments, as well as be able to deliver a lecture today. So that's caveat number one. Caveat number two is that this is basically a lecture for, it's really a very, very lightly changed lecture to what I would give to just a political science audience. So be it as it may, that suggests that, you know, if any of you are not political scientists, or if this if anything is unclear, please don't hesitate to put your hand up and ask for any clarification questions. I don't want to lose anybody along the journey. So if anything is unclear, please, it won't be rude. I actually appreciate if you just let me know that I'm being unclear in some way. Okay. So like I said, this is a book project, entitled Democracy Through Strength. And basically what we're trying to accomplish in this book is really try to write something that doesn't really exist in political science right now, which is a really sort of sweeping historical treatment of democracy and authoritarianism in East Asia. We have, pretty canonical books on these questions in regions like the Middle East and Latin America and Eastern Europe, but we don't really have a definitive work that looks at these issues in East Asia. And to the extent that we do, they tend to be edited volumes, which don't have a single kind of theoretical framework that they're looking at the region through, but will just be sort of be a grab bag of a bunch of different essays. So someone will write a Thailand chapter and someone will write a Vietnam chapter and this sort of thing. So what we're going to try to do is really try to write a book on that's quite sweeping in its coverage of Northeast and Southeast Asia, as I'll discuss. But in true UChicago style, we'll try to do so through a clear theoretical framework, which hopefully will travel to other times and places, or we can at least try to see how it works in other times and places. Because as we say at the University of Chicago, that's all well and good in practice, but how does it work in theory? So this will be a mix of talking about the region, but also the theory in which the argument is embedded. So maybe the best way to start off the talk is sort of with this question and these two competing images. So how is democracy born? Overwhelmingly, what political scientists would argue, and I think the way we understand the way democracy arises in our sort of public understandings in the media and the like, is through the scenario on the left. So this is from 1986, and this is with the fall of the Marcos regime in the Philippines. So these are both instances of democratization in the 1980s in East and Southeast Asia. Okay, but through very, very different kind of mechanisms. So you can't, it's a little bit hard to see, but you can see Corazon Aquino is here taking the oath of office, just as No Tae-woo in South Korea a couple years later is taking the oath of office in South Korea. But so as we can see here, this is sort of the consummate example of democracy is born when a dictator flees. A dictator runs for the hills. A dictator is chased out of office through some massive protest, and basically as the last ditch in a last moment to save his own skin, he says, okay, fine, I'll exit the palace, I'll go into exile, you take over the country, and I'm out of here. Right? So this is sort of our common image. So democracy arises through a collapse. So an authoritarian regime has to just outright collapse for a democracy to be born. So this is how we tend to think about things. And I'm going to make the case that our theories in political science are built around the notion that that's how democracy comes about. But then you have this scenario. So No Tae-woo was, at this point, he's the democratically elected president of South Korea. But before that, he was a military dictator of South Korea. And he presided over a series of decisive and deep democratic reforms, which basically freed the press, allowed political parties to operate totally unmolested, produced an independent election commission, quite important for free and fair elections, and really the whole battery of democratic reforms, which meant that government and opposition could actually have a fair contest, and there wouldn't be the use of repression and intimidation against political opposition. Okay, so nobody questions, 30 years after the fact, that both the Philippines and South Korea truly became democracies through these moments. But they came about in entirely different ways. And what I want to argue is that, so whereas the Marcos case in the Philippines is a consummate example of democracy through weakness, so the weakness of the authoritarian regime that collapsed, South Korea, under No Tae-woo, is a classic example of democracy through strength. And that, in fact, not only is democracy through strength a viable way that democracy can come about, but that in East and Southeast Asia, it's actually the most common way in which democracy has come about in this region. And yet we haven't theorized this well in political science. We basically see democracy arising through weakness and not through strength. Okay, so the project, just kind of overview. So we're looking at broadly this region we call developmental Asia, which is our way of sort of linking Northeast and Southeast Asia. So we're basically looking at 12 countries, all of which to some degree or another sort of followed in the path of the Japanese developmental state, have pursued export-led growth, state-led but market-oriented economic development strategies, and rapid growth during the Cold War period and beyond. I'll say a bit more about the region in a moment. So the puzzle is, the big theoretical puzzle, especially for political scientists, is so this region has lots of economic development, but a lot less democratization. Okay, it's not no democratization, because as I'll show, half of the 12 cases we look at have democratized at one time or another, and half have not. So there is a substantial amount of democratization in the region, but considering that one of the most common and robust correlations in all of political science is that as countries become more economically developed, they're more likely to become democracies. it is a puzzle that we have, that with how much economic development we have in the region, that we don't have as much democratization as our theories would lead us to expect. So not just China, but Singapore, Malaysia, these are huge outliers. These are huge, unexpected, durable authoritarian regimes, despite growing so much over the past decades. So the question we're really asking here, because all projects just start with a question, is how can we best explain developmental Asia's uneven experience with democratic reforms? The approach we're taking is we're examining developmental Asia's uneven democratization from a regional perspective and also a historical perspective. So we realize, I think there are common features to the region, lots of variations in the themes, but I want to make the case that we can think of this as a region which has undergone some similar processes. And the argument we're making is that in developmental Asia, the primary mode of democratization has been democracy through strength. Okay, so let me say a little bit more about exactly what I mean by democracy through strength as opposed to democracy through weakness. Okay, so everything on the left is a democracy through weakness scenario. Everything on the right is a democracy through strength scenario. So you can remember those pictures of Marcos and Noteu, right? And this is basically those pictures in these words. Okay. And although any case of democratization will almost always include some features of both, basically as political scientists, we think a lot about, and we have a very good sense of these dynamics, but not of these. So in almost any case, we're sort of thinking about what role does the strength of the pre-existing authoritarian regime play in the democratization of the country. So for starters, democracy through weakness is about institutional weakness as opposed to institutional strength. Okay, so that's what we really mean by weakness and strength. And the institutions we're talking about here are, authoritarian regimes that have a particularly powerful ruling party, for instance, that have a particularly effective state apparatus, so that has been able to generate political stability. Whether or not there's been a history of economic growth, which has led to kind of the rise of middle classes. Okay, this is what we see in the strength scenarios. In the weakness scenarios, these are regimes that are kind of rest on a single dictator. They have an ineffective state. There's no real political party that can really organize political support for the regime. And so you can see when you look at different authoritarian regimes, you can assess their institutional strength or weakness. Okay. So then what happens in the process? Well, in the weakness scenario, typically the rulers are very, very divided. And so transition happens when there's some big split within the regime. So as Guillermo O'Donnell and Philippe Schmitter have very famously argued, they've said that they study Latin America and Southern Europe, and they said there has never been a democratic transition that was not the product of divisions within the ruling elite. That's how it always starts. And we're saying, actually, that just isn't true. When you look at Northeast and Southeast Asia, you do get democratization without major splits within the ruling elite. In fact, as I say, rulers are relatively unified in the democracy through strength scenario. Okay? And the next step, it's not that they democratize as a last resort. So again, you're at death's door, and so you save your own skin by fleeing the palace and handing over to whomever can come and seize the palace. This is a proactive strategy. And so this is a way for current rulers who are ruling in an authoritarian manner to be able to hopefully stay in power, but in a more democratic manner. Open up the political process, hold free and fair elections, and try to win those elections. Okay? So the next 2 points are sort of especially vital, or maybe especially clarifying. So the next one, we think in political science that a dictator will only give up power or will only allow democracy in the face of a serious violent threat. So, or some sense that revolution is in the offing. So rather than going down violently in some kind of massive revolutionary upheaval, you say, well, I just want to survive, so I'll give up first, right? But what I want to argue is that in fact, a mere threat of violence is not enough to get an authoritarian regime to democratize, because in fact, it's not necessarily a solution to the problem. The only way that democracy is a solution to the problem of instability is if you have some expectation that stability can be preserved under democratic conditions. So rather than looking at to what degree a dictator is forced by some kind of threat to leave power, we should be looking at what is it that allows an authoritarian regime to believe that stability could be preserved under democratic conditions. Okay, so that's a kind of, I think, a major shift in the way we think about these things. So I'll talk a lot more about that. The next point, again, I think is hopefully pretty clarifying, is that it's not the same thing to concede democracy and to concede defeat. Okay, so in our theory, like pretty much any theory in political science, we assume rulers want to stay in power. We don't think anyone is interested in abdicating and they want to give up power out of for the good of the country or something like that. Okay, now in any country, is that a very plausible way of starting our theories of politics, right? People want to stay in power, but you can concede democracy, and you can stop using authoritarian controls without conceding defeat. Because again, it's not that you're saying, it's not just again handing over the palace to your opponents. It's saying, let's hold a free and fair election. Let's allow opponents to organize. Let's allow them to have free speech. Let's allow them to go into the public square. And then we'll compete, and then we could still win. So in cases like Taiwan, South Korea, Indonesia, you still have the same, figures from the old authoritarian period are still in power. They can win democratic elections. These are real democracies, but it didn't mean conceding defeat necessarily. Okay, so when people say things like, well, it's either democracy or it's the CCP, it's like, well, I like the CCP. The CCP does good things, so we want that, not democracy. That's a false choice. It's actually possible that you could have democracy and continue to vote for the CCP. In a place like Singapore, people say, well, the People's Action Party, the PAP, is very effective, so we don't need democracy, we have the PAP. We want the PAP. Again, that's not a choice that has to be made. You could love the PAP and still say, let's democratize the country, and we can keep voting for the PAP as a democratic party, as has happened through much of Asia. Okay? So just a few more points. So with the weakness scenario, the legitimacy of the old authoritarian regime is totally relinquished. There's no longer any more right to rule. They sort of head for the hills and the regime is over. But what happens in the strength scenario is that legitimacy gets redefined. So the government stays in power, but they do so through new claims. They claim a right to rule in a new, revamped, and revitalized kind of way. So it could take the form of, well, we had to use authoritarian controls for many years because we were very poor and we needed economic development, and that was the priority. But now we've come to a stage in this country where we can move to the next level and we feel like we can have democratic reform. The old kind of repression of the past is outdated, and we don't need to do that anymore. This is exactly the kind of language that was used in South Korea, in Taiwan, and in Indonesia, Thailand, and has begun to be used in Myanmar in recent years as well. Okay? So redefining legitimacy, drawing on what you've done in the past, but making new claims about how you're going to rule. So with the weakness scenario, you have a sudden collapse. The strength scenario, you have gradual reform. So this doesn't happen overnight, but you have usually just a set of reforms that are, it can happen relatively quickly, but they're happening in a planned manner rather than it happening in a forced way. And last but not least, when you have democracy through weakness, you have total upheaval in who rules and who does not rule. And so who's the coalition? So people who are outside of power come into power, people who are in power get kicked out of power, and we have this huge turnover, right? When democracy occurs through strength, you actually have a lot of continuity in who's in power. So a lot of people who were in power under authoritarian conditions remain in power under democratic conditions. So there's a lot more continuity in terms of who is actually operating the government. Okay? So the goals in the book are twofold. One is to introduce democracy through strength as a general phenomenon, as a theoretical corrective to a literature that focuses on weakness and not strength. And we want to apply it to the specific historical context of developmental Asia after World War II. Okay, so let me say a little more about what we mean by developmental Asia. So as I was saying, this is sort of this, again, it transcends Northeast and Southeast Asia. And just say a few things about it, which hopefully both embrace the diversity of the region. There are really some very different patterns in the region, but also some shared experiences, which I think make them a reasonable region to think about. So first of all, a defining feature of the region is response to Western imperialism, and the fact that the response was largely perceived as an imperative of national catch-up, so trying to catch up with the West. And so this is led, importantly, by Japan. Okay, so Japan was really the leader of this and the inventor of the so-called developmental state, starting with the Meiji Restoration. And so both through its example, but also through direct colonialism in places like Korea and Taiwan, Japan kind of spreads this developmental state model. Okay, so this is one major feature of the region to keep in mind, and the importance of Japan, which I think is often underappreciated. Okay. Second, you have the projection into the region of Anglo-American power. First British power during the colonial period, and then especially American power after the end of World War II. And so this leads to some heterogeneity in the kinds of cases we see, but again, also is sort of a general theme for the region. So in the British cases, we get the introduction of these pretty conservative legal regimes and these parliamentary systems. So this is in the cases of Singapore, Malaysia, and in Hong Kong, which we're looking at in the book. And then obviously the United States has enormous leverage in the region during the Cold War period. And so then first in Japan through direct occupation, but then also it certainly is a major player in its allies such as South Korea, Taiwan, to a lesser extent Indonesia, when those countries democratize as well. So again, these countries are not in a petri dish, they're not in a test tube. This is East Asia, developmental Asia is an area of tremendous superpower influence and competing superpower influences in the region. Okay? Now third, I think it's interesting to think about the role of China in the region. I think the general perception in the media or in the public about democracy and authoritarianism in Asia is China is authoritarian, China dominates Asia, therefore Asia is also authoritarian. So it's this region, this China-dominated region in which, and so that's kind of the people's starting point. And we really want to kind of make the point that that's just not really how to think about it at all. There is certainly substantial Chinese influence in the region, but it's extremely uneven. And it's also very belated. So in the kind of places we're going to be talking about, actually China did not have much influence. In fact, China didn't even really join the region of developmental Asia until at least the late 70s, arguably till the 80s and 90s in terms of its developmental model. So it's not region-wide, and it tends to be these very bilateral type relationships with countries like, say, Vietnam and Myanmar as well, although in the case of Myanmar, we can see even there was much less influence, much less ability to kind of control the fates of reforms in Myanmar than people expected, given the fact that Myanmar and China were so close. Okay? But also in terms of the heterogeneity of the kinds of political systems we see, that obviously China itself, but then also these other developmental socialist cases like Vietnam, they're associated with single-party systems rather than multi-party systems. And it's enormously important whether whether your starting point here is a single party or multiple parties, for reasons that will hopefully become clear. I think it's still worth keeping them in the same book and thinking about them through the same framework, because I think our theory tells you something about why that matters in particular ways, but there is a very substantial difference on that basis. So one point just to conclude with here is that when we say developmental Asia, we define it and we determine it politically, not just geographically. So you don't just, if you're in the map in Northeast or Southeast Asia, that doesn't make you part of developmental Asia. Developmental Asia is a region you join through your policies and your development strategy. It's not something that you just get by location. So for instance, the Philippines, which we talked about at the beginning, North Korea, Laos, Mongolia, Brunei, Timor-Leste, these are all cases but they're not developmental Asia. So we're not seeking to apply the theory to those cases. They haven't built up the kind of strengths that we look at through a developmental state over a period of time. Okay? All right, so here's the variation. All right, so this is what comparative politics people love. They love variation. Okay, so there's two kinds of variation I want to call your attention to here. First of all, most starkly is the variation between what we call the democratic or the concession cases that at some time or another have either been democratic or have either pursued democracy through strength or have gone through some kind of process of democratic concession. All right, so these 6 cases on the left, and then the authoritarian cases on the right, or these what we call candidate cases. We don't want to call them negative cases because our argument is that any of these 6 cases on the right could in fact pursue democracy through strength, and that they have enough strength they could pursue democracy proactively, and you should be able to expect a fair amount of political stability to result from that. Okay, so just briefly talk through some of these cases on the left. So that's one spectrum, but the other spectrum is vertical. Okay, so in each column, the cases on the top are higher levels of institutional strength than those at the bottom. Okay, so there's a spectrum within each family of cases as well. Okay, so whereas these Northeast Asian cases like Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, when they democratized, had extremely strong state apparatuses, very strong political parties, big middle classes, they had a pretty serious history of poverty reduction, right? It is less true of the cases in the lower part of the chart. So less so in Indonesia, less so in Thailand, less so in Myanmar. So Thailand and Myanmar in particular are more military regimes, weaker political parties, and although they have attempted to pursue democracy through strength. It's been a much more wobbly process precisely because they don't have as much institutional strength to be able to stabilize and to be able to stay on top during the democratization process as cases like, say, Taiwan and South Korea. Okay? So there's a real spectrum going from top to bottom here, right? So then on the authoritarian cases, Singapore, I think, is the consummate example of a case with tremendous institutional strength and where there would be no reason to believe that a democratic transition would be destabilizing if the regime decided to basically remove its battery of authoritarian controls tomorrow. It would basically be something very easy for them to do. And then we go down the list to other cases where there are lesser but still substantial authoritarian strength. So one thing to call your attention to is the placement of China. Okay, so again, if you read the papers, you think China is one of two things. Either China is this house of cards, which is on the verge at any moment of combusting and collapsing, and so we see David Shambaugh's recent article. It's like, so it's about to go, right? So we've been hearing that for 25 years, right? So that's just any moment now, right? But then the other side of the argument is like, well, no, this is absolutely the strongest, most powerful, most untouchable behemoth and colossus of a regime that has ever lived in the globe, right? And so there's this incredibly, bifurcated understanding of what China is. And what we're showing is that it's in the middle. It's actually intermediate. I mean, China has institutional strengths that Vietnam and Cambodia lack, but it lacks certain strengths and certain sources of stability that, say, Singapore and Malaysia have. Okay? So it's in between. So I think that's just a much more, I think a much more plausible way of thinking about the case of China. And it just shows you it's much more indeterminate. It's not obvious what's going to happen in China at all. It's not it's not doomed to collapse, and it's not utterly invincible, right? There's really just almost no such thing as a regime like that, right? So it's an intermediate case, not an extreme case, okay? So intermediate levels, so state capacity, the strengths of the political party, its developmental record, its growth of the middle class, all of these things are, again, in an intermediate level, making it, which means that it's not the best candidate ever for democracy through strength, but it is still, we would argue, has substantial strengths and could, in fact, do this, okay? All right, so hopefully now you understand what democracy through strength is. And so now what I want to do is introduce our theory for when and why it happens. So when and why do authoritarian regimes pursue democracy through strength? Okay? And so our argument proceeds in 3 steps. Okay? So for it to happen, we argue you need strengths, obviously. But then you need what we call signals, and you need strategies. So the story of democracy through strength is a story of strengths, signals, and strategies. And so what I want to do next is basically talk through each of these 3 building blocks of the theory. Okay, so it's not like a single cause theory, but hopefully it's not impossibly complex either. Okay, but as you'll see, there's a lot of complexity within each of these categories, which we can start talking about. Okay, so first of all, strengths. So the first factor is, again, if you want to do democracy through strength, you need strength by definition, right? So, but it's important to note here, it has to be antecedent strength. It has to be pre-existing strength, okay, because it rests in institutions. And institutions don't become strong overnight. It's something that takes time. And so there's really 2 kinds of strength that are especially important here, and 2 kinds of confidence. So this is one of the most important things I want you to remember, these concepts. Stability confidence and victory confidence, okay? So the antecedent strength of the state, so state strength, is the main source of stability confidence. And by that we mean the expectation that political stability will be preserved under democratic conditions, okay? So you need to have stability confidence, right? And so by an effective state, we're talking about the administrative apparatus, how well it governs, whether the military and the police and the coercive apparatus are actually organized, whether they follow orders, whether they're fragmented. These are like, this is a major variable in regimes around the world. Has there been a history of poverty reduction and expanding the middle class through state-led development? And then in the process, what this builds is relatively moderate, pragmatic, and even conservative electorates. So the stronger the developmental state, the more of a kind of developmental voter it creates. So in a place like Taiwan, in a place like Singapore, people are incredibly focused on issues of economic performance, development, delivery. They do not have radical policy demands. Because again, a history of development kind of makes you want development. Okay? So this is the first part of it. So stability confidence. So to the extent you have these things in place, you can pursue democratic reforms, level playing field, lift controls on opposition and on dissent without, without provoking a lot of instability. Okay, the second feature though is victory confidence. Okay, and so victory confidence is the incumbent's expectation of faring well in democratic elections. And so there, the institution that's most important is not the state apparatus, but the political party. Because obviously it's political parties that have to compete in elections, right? So to what degree does the political party under authoritarian conditions believe that it can jump into democracy and fare well in democratic elections? And here, again, we don't have to just sort of, there are actually some good reasons to believe we have some ideas about what those strengths would entail. So does the party have cross-cutting constituencies? So is the party strictly the party of a single region, or of a single economic class, or of a single ethnic group? Okay, if so, they would be less confident that they could win elections under democratic conditions, right? But to the extent that a party during authoritarian times has built up this kind of the support and constituencies across the cross-section of a diverse country, victory confidence should be higher, right? Next, do you have a territorial encompassing infrastructure? Do you have party branches? Do you have party cells? Do you have party intelligence networks at the local grassroots street level? Okay, if so, again, you can parlay that infrastructure you have into knowledge under democracy and into being competitive and being able to be responsive to voter concerns under democracy. Again, right? So do you have that infrastructure or not? And so here I think is a very big difference in China between number 2 and number 3. Number 2, that kind of, that sounds like the CCP, right? An encompassing infrastructure, right? But what the CCP does not have to the same degree as, say, dominant parties in Malaysia or Singapore, for instance, is experienced electoral candidates. Okay, and this is where the single party nature of the system is quite important. So do you sort of know, if we had free and fair elections tomorrow, how different our party members would do in different regions of the country and running in elections? Okay, I can tell you absolutely how candidates in Singapore and Malaysia would do in elections if they lifted authoritarian controls within a pretty small band of uncertainty. Because they have elections all the time, it would be the same candidates, they'd be running the same constituencies. We've built up decades of knowledge and information about how well they would fare in a truly fair electoral contest. I think in a place like China or Vietnam, it's much harder to know. Therefore, it's much harder to generate victory confidence in a party like the CCP than it is in a party like the PAP in Singapore, for instance, or that it was in a party even like Golkar in Indonesia, where, again, you had a really powerful party apparatus that spread through the entire Indonesian archipelago. So when they democratized, they knew they had an advantage over all their opponents. They knew they were the ones who had, experienced politicians at the local level who could compete and win even without having authoritarian controls. Okay? And last is the question of a developmental track record. Okay, again, this gives you victory confidence. If you can say, look how we've developed the country, look how we've moved us from third world to first, this then is something you can draw upon as a major campaign plank. So again, this is where, merely because, in a sense, I guess what I'm saying is a political party does not need to be democratic or authoritarian at all. It's just a political party. The question is, what's the system in which it operates? And so you could take a party which just so happens to be existing in an authoritarian context, you can democratize the political system, and the party then, it still has the same track record. It still has the same people. They can still say, look, we're the most qualified people, most experienced people to govern this country, so you should vote for us. All right? You should support us. Okay, so, but again, whether you have victory confidence depends a lot on how much of that track record you can draw upon. And I would just say that even in a case like Indonesia, which democratized in the most colossal economic crisis of the last 50 years, even there, decades of development meant that the ruling party was able to parlay that record into actually doing quite well. So the bar here is not unbelievably high. A case like Indonesia shows you this. Even in a case like Myanmar, where they're sort of trying to do this sort of reform agenda, even there, the fact the economy's been doing just the past couple of years, after 50 years of complete neglect, mismanagement, terrible governance, actually suggests that the USDP, the ruling party in Myanmar, might do less badly than one might think in the elections, given that they have some kind of agenda for developing the country, and could argue, well, the opposition really doesn't. Okay, so Myanmar really pushes this to the limits of how weak can you be and still try to do this? But even in a case like Myanmar, which is a relatively weak regime, even there, it fits the strength scenario, not the weakness scenario. They didn't start pursuing these democratic reforms at a time when there were 100,000 people in the streets. They could have done this in 1988, 1990, 2007. There have been lots of moments when our existing theories in political science would have expected the military regime in Myanmar to say, okay, now we're going to, everything's falling apart, so sure, let's democratize. In fact, what they did in 2011 was only after they had really been stabilizing the country for some time, they had dealt with protests, the economy had been improving for a while, then they said, okay, now let's try to democratize. Because now we have a chance of doing so without losing everything and while maintaining stability. Okay? All right. So that's factor one, antecedent strengths. But it's critical to note this is not the whole story. Okay? So strength alone cannot explain democratic concessions. So we are not arguing, well, as you get stronger, then you're more likely to concede democratic reforms. It means you're more likely to thrive under democracy if you do so. But why you concede these reforms is not because you're strong per se, all right? So, and this is captured, I think, kind of vividly by, again, our same spectrum here. Again, strongest cases on top, weakest cases on the bottom. This is by Northeast versus Southeast Asia. And what you see, the cases in italics are ones that have had democracy through strength. The ones that are not italicized have not. And what you see is there's absolutely no relationship, okay? So the very strongest cases in Northeast Asia have pursued democracy through strength. The strongest cases in Southeast Asia have not. Obviously, the fact that you were seeing this unfold in Myanmar but not Singapore tells you strength itself is not determinative, right? It's not what tells you whether or not you're going to get this strategy to unfold, okay? And just one more point to make here is that we basically are arguing that you can look at this spectrum of authoritarian strength, and basically this should give you a very, very good picture of what kind of democratic success the outgoing party would have under democracy. That generally, if we look at places like, for instance, Taiwan, South Korea, Indonesia, we can identify how weak or strong they were during the authoritarian period, and that is translated into exactly the same kind of spectrum of electoral success and economic success and the like under democracy. So we think of, in a way we think, well, the move from authoritarianism to democracy is the most shocking, overwhelming overturning of everything, and who knows what would happen, right? But in fact, the political system is defined more by political parties and more by the state apparatus, and that endures. And so, in fact, there's a lot less maybe that changes or becomes overhauled just when you move from an authoritarian to a democratic political system than you might think, okay? All right, so if strength can't explain democratic concessions, and you need strength to do democracy through strength, but what explains why some concede democratic reforms and some don't? And here we have a theory of signals, okay? And again, the next thing I want you to remember victory confidence, remember stability confidence, remember the idea of the bittersweet spot. Okay, this is the next concept I want you to remember. Okay, so you need signals. So we're arguing that even historically strong authoritarian regimes should not be expected, at least in our theory, to pursue democracy through strength when stable domination still seems attainable under authoritarianism. Okay, so this is not something that rulers are going to undertake lightly. Okay, it's going to seem like a risk. I mean, obviously the status quo is also a risk, but it's going to seem like a risk. So if things seem like they're moving along just fine, we do not expect, this is your sort of your Singapore example, right? Things seem to be going along pretty fine. Why would we take the risk of doing these political reforms? So what has to happen? We argue that they have to receive these clear and strong signals that they are no longer strong enough to dominate under dictatorship, except by using devastating force. But at the same time, they remain strong enough to thrive under democracy. Okay, so this is what we call the bittersweet spot, where a democracy through strength strategy is likeliest to unfold. Okay, so it's a sweet spot in the sense that if you miss it, it's a window of opportunity. There's a period of time when you have a certain level of strength, so that you could say, let's hold free and fair elections and still win, or at least fare quite well. Okay, and over time, you're likely to become weaker and weaker. Authoritarian regimes tend not to really weaken and then strengthen in a major way again. And that's partly a feature of demographics, right? Authoritarian regimes tend not to be able to do a great job of bringing the youngest people into a party in a better way than they did with older folks as well, right? So it's not, decline of an authoritarian regime is not inevitable, but there are things that make it difficult once you've lost a degree of popularity to go back to your previous level. So there's sort of an apex of power for these regimes, and once it gets passed, it's hard to get it back. Okay, so it's a sweet spot because you got to do it in this moment. It's a bittersweet spot because it comes generally with bad news, right? Especially with stronger regimes which have been cruising along without any trouble, and then wait, all of a sudden things are getting a little bit worse. So they're not at death's door. There's no imminent threat of a violent overthrow of the government, but there is a sense that we can't keep doing things in the same way and expect the same results. The conditions have changed, partly because of the development they've generated themselves, right? They're trying to change the country, but in changing the country, they make it a question whether or not they can continue to govern in the same way. So there are 4 kinds of signals that we talk about that these regimes can receive. The first are electoral signals, right? And these are the clearest kinds of signals. This is basically when the dominant party starts basically sliding toward parity with the opposition. So you've been winning in huge landslides, and now elections are getting a little bit closer, a little bit closer, a little bit closer. And the good thing about elections as a signal is they're extremely clear. They're, you can quantify them. I mean, in a very measurable way whether your popularity vis-a-vis other parties is rising, declining, and what have you, right? So elections are especially helpful signals because they're very, very clear. But the strongest signals, we argue, are contentious signals. This is protest. So when, again, nothing is going to make an authoritarian regime stand up and pay attention, like a whole lot of protest in the streets. And it's not just how much protest there is, but what kind it is. So especially if protest is cross-class in character, or cross-ethnic, or it's not just one small group demanding something for itself, but it seems to take on a more nationalist character and a more nationalist sense of demand for change for the country's sake. Those kinds of protests, like the Minjung movement in Korea, the Reformasi movement in Indonesia, the Donghuai movement in Taiwan, these were movements that are sort of really make authoritarian regimes stand up and pay attention. It doesn't mean you have to concede democracy, but that's one possible response to as a way of dealing with these signals of incipient beginning decline as a regime. Now, the next kind of signals are less important but still worth considering. So there are economic signals. And here is when you basically see some kind of exhaustion of your developmental legitimacy. So if there's an economic crisis, or you think about the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s is a particularly good example of this in places like Indonesia and Malaysia, where basically no longer was economic development enough to sort of say that's enough of a reason you should stick with us, because clearly the economy had gone south. Okay, so if developmental legitimacy doesn't seem to be enough, that's economic crises can play a role in sparking reforms. And last, what we're loosely calling geopolitical signals, so signals from the international system. And so here you can think about the end of the Cold War, for instance. So to what degree are the superpowers willing to countenance and accept the fact that some level of authoritarianism in its allies is acceptable, right? So the United States behaved very differently before and after the Cold War in this regard. And so we can think of the end of the Cold War in some way as the biggest geopolitical shock or biggest geopolitical signal of trouble for long-ruling authoritarian regimes in the world. And so you can also think about the case of Taiwan is very important here. So where once the United States recognized mainland China and no longer recognized Taiwan as the legitimate government of Taiwan, it created this huge geopolitical shock in Taiwan that sort of said, well, so on what basis would anyone come to our defense if it comes to a war? And it was only by portraying themselves as, quote unquote, the democratic China, they could start generating support in the United States again and generating goodwill from superpower allies, okay, for its own protection. And also, another kind of signal that happens geopolitically or in the international system is just sort of diffusion. Like, we have really good reason to believe that regime types tend to diffuse within a region. So you think about like Eastern Europe as the classic example when the Berlin Wall comes down. So you don't need a different, kind of a totally different theory for why the Czech Republic democratized and why Poland democratized and for why Romania democratized. It was part of one big wave, right? So to the extent that we see that one kind of regime type seems to be on the rise or on the decline in a region, that's also, I think, a signal which can give really some strength to some people within a regime who prefer reform versus those who don't. Because that's what it's going to come down to at the next step. What's going to come down to at the next step is, do people within the government believe that democracy through strength is the right strategy, or do they not believe that? And that's the most contingent part of the argument, but it does come down to some kind of strategic move. Okay? So let me just, before talking more about the strategies, let me just say a little bit more about signals. Okay? So how do we know signals when we see them? So let's talk about elections a little bit. Now, one problem with all of this is it's very, very hard to know, and people will almost never entirely agree about whether a regime is entering the bittersweet spot, exiting the bittersweet spot, or everything's going okay. So let's take an especially clear example of very, very clear signals. Let's look at Singapore. So what we have here is, so the dominant party, the PAP, the blue line is its vote share since 1968, and the red line is its seat share. Okay? So it gets a lot more seats than votes because of disproportionality and gerrymandering in the electoral system. But what we can see is, you can see the trend, right? I mean, you can see this is a party that's gone from complete and utter total domination to one where, well, it's declining, right? It's clearly not as dominant as it was 10, 20 years ago, okay? So these are very clear signals. This is kind of an ideal case of saying, like, there's actually a trend, okay? But they're very weak signals, right? You still have, I mean, the party still got 60% of the vote, and it's still got well over 90% of all of the seats. So this is not exactly cause for alarm among the PAP, that things are falling apart in a hurry here, right? So the question, so when I'm in Singapore, people say, well, so is Singapore, have they entered the bittersweet spot, right? It's like, well, people will I think this is something we could disagree about, right? My own sense is that it would probably take 1 or 2 more elections that keep going in this direction before pressures within the party for some kind of change of strategy will become real strong. Because at this point, there's very little clamor for political change, given how mild the signals are. And in fact, so while I was just in Singapore, the Prime Minister gave his May Day speech, in which he basically said there was no talk of, this is the end of an era, now that my father, Lee Kuan Yew, has passed away. It was, we've had great leadership, so what we need is more great leadership. Okay? So it was very much a stay the course kind of tone, and it was kind of an election, it was sort of an election rally speech because they're playing elections pretty soon. So it's really going to be interesting to see, so to the extent they bounce back, if they do bounce back up, perhaps in the in the aftermath of all the goodwill toward Lee Kuan Yew and his son, then perhaps you say, well, then there's no more signal of decline. There's no reason why we should be considering political reform. But if the decline continues, then I think we're going to see more and more pressure for it. Okay, so entering the bittersweet spot, probably not quite yet, but you can see it. You see it not being very far away. But then signals aren't always so clear. So let's look at Malaysia for a second. So the top 2 lines are the vote and seat share for the ruling coalition, the BN, and the bottom ones are for the ruling party, the dominant party, UMNO. And what you see here is, well, don't even try to figure this out, because the whole point is there's no clear signal. This is an utterly muddy signal, mixed signals of how are we doing? Are things getting better? Are they getting worse? They keep getting worse and then better and then worse and then better and worse and then better from the regime's perspective. Although, again, this slope, pretty comparable, actually steeper than what's happened in the case of Singapore, right? But again, you've had moments of where things bounce back, and so that allows people within the dominant party who don't want to pursue a reform strategy to say, no, look, we can always come back, right? We're not in decline. We had one bad election, then we had a good election. But the thing is that while all of this very, very muddy sort of process of decline was going on, they really, really sank in a serious way, such that now the ruling coalition actually lost the last election. They've got less than 50% of the vote, and they're down to about 60% of the seats. So at this point, the question is really, have they exited the bittersweet spot? I mean, is it to the point now where if they did, in fact, say, introduce an independent election commission in Malaysia, and they eliminate, and if they let the opposition leader out of prison, would the government win the next election? I don't think it's clear that they would at all. And so they may have, by not, and here's why you have to do these things. This is why it's a sweet spot, right? You can miss your opportunity. Because if, and everyone I talked to in the government in Malaysia agrees with this, if they had had the foresight to pursue democratic reforms around here, they would still be up here. They wouldn't have had this collapse, because the only reason they've collapsed so much is because the opposition finally got its act together and built a coalition in response. And the only issue that unifies them is that they are disgusted with the authoritarianism of the government. So another point here about why these reforms are so strategic for authoritarian regimes to pursue, this is not giving up, this is redeploying your power, is because it actually tends to divide your opposition. So in South Korea and Indonesia and in Malaysia, the only thing that really brought opposition together during the authoritarian period was that it was an authoritarian period. They all wanted to change the political system. They were all fed up with repression and control and the like. And so they came together. But as soon as someone like No Tae-u or Jiang Jingguo or B.J. Habibie, as soon as they introduced democratic reforms, the opposition split. There's no longer anything to hold them together. So again, if you're an authoritarian leader, what you want to do more than anything else is split your opposition, right? Well, the best way to split your opposition is stop being authoritarian. True. I mean, it happens time and time again. And if they, again, even if they did it now, this is why I don't think it's too late for the government in Malaysia to do this, because if they did do it, if they took the issue of authoritarian control off the table, they would probably split the opposition and keep winning elections, is what I would guess. And if they did lose, they wouldn't lose by much. They have a lot of antecedent strength. Okay, so mixed signals, but again, this is not a theory where I can tell. It depends on whether people interpret it as a bittersweet spot or not. And social science can't tell you in an incredibly precise way, like, oh, when you hit 57%, that's when you're, I mean, I would be lying. Like, I could say that, but I would just be lying to you, right? So what it comes down to at the end of the day is human beings. Human beings who have power, who make strategies and calculations about what to do with their political power. Okay, so we get to the strategies. Okay, so democracy through strength is never a structural imperative. It's never a forced move. It's never when your king, if you play chess and your king is in one place, it's in check, and there's only one place you can move it. Right? It's never that. Okay, there's too much agency in the world for that, especially if you're a strong regime. Right? So it's a product of strategic calculation and usually of elite power struggle in this bittersweet spot. Okay, so during this moment, during this bittersweet spot, we basically say some kind of struggle, some kind of debate will emerge within the party. And if you're going to have democratic concessions, what that requires is the victory of a coalition within the ruling regime that interprets these bittersweet signals as, quote unquote, the end of an era. All right, that's the kind of language you look for. This is the end of an era. And those people have to prevail politically over those who perceive that stable authoritarian domination remains attainable. Okay, and that's just a political battle. We don't know who's going to win in that political battle. So what you end up looking for is what we call new and public legitimation strategies. These are sort of the causal mechanism through which you go from strengths and signals to the actual concession outcomes. So we are not saying that we can climb inside the head of people in these regimes and know how they think, but what we can do is we know how they talk. And so when they start saying things like, this is the end of an era, we can't do things in the same way anymore, we need a fundamental change in the way we do things, those are hard promises to go back on. It can happen, but that's not cheap talk. And so you look for that kind of language coming from leaders. And that's exactly what we heard from, again, the likes of Jiang Jingguo, B.J. Habibie, No Tae-u, Thein Sein in Myanmar, and also among military rulers in the 80s in Thailand. Okay? So, but critical point here, right? Okay, so you want legitimacy. Well, there's more than one way to get legitimacy. This is the next issue. And this is really, really vital in all of the authoritarian cases I've talked about, including China, which is that legitimacy does not only come from democracy, right? And authoritarian regimes can, and even beyond that, even when they're in a position where they feel they need to redefine their legitimacy, they can do so not with democratic reforms, but with economic reforms and with governance reforms, sort of trying to change how governance works, but without actually opening up the political system in a major way. And so what we have in a place like China is not just standing still. There's constant, in Vietnam, Hong Kong, there's a constant experiment with a lot of different kinds of reforms. They're just not democratic reforms. Okay? So what I want to do in the next slide is give a sense of, well, what's that all about? What does that look like? So what I argue is that there are a lot of authoritarian reforms that can occur without democratization taking place. And so here's a basic typology or a basic framework for thinking about it. So on the left to right scale, we have different types of reform. So you have economic reforms, you have governance reforms, you can have democratic reforms. And then those can be of differing depths. So you can have very superficial reforms. These are like try to polish your image as a regime, but don't really change very much substantively. I'm sure such a thing would never happen, of course. And the politician would never do something like that, right? Or they could really be much more substantive reforms that actually do produce some serious change in how things are governed. And so it's only, among these 6 types, it's only type 6 that actually get you to electoral democratization. Okay? And those kind of reforms have been introduced in those 6 cases on the left I've talked about. So it's not, this shouldn't be seen as unrealistic. But the point is there's all other kinds of things that a dominant party or some kind of authoritarian regime can do short of leveling the playing field as a way of trying to restore, revitalize, revamp its legitimacy. Okay? And so, you can think about this. There's things when people talk about having intra-party elections, right? So you say, well, where the dominant party will start having party elections within the party to say, well, we'll become a democratic party that way. Okay, but that doesn't democratize the country because a democracy is one where the government treats the opposition in a certain way. You don't become a democracy because of how you make decisions within the political party, within the ruling party. You become a democracy because you stop repressing people who are outside of your political party, right? So that's basically, so it looks democratic, so we're democratizing the party. This is what UMNO has done in Malaysia recently. They've started having intra-party elections. That tells you absolutely nothing about how democratic the political system is. 0. Okay? But you can do things like you expand the welfare state, more provision, more public goods. You can try to reform the bureaucracy, reform the police, try to reduce corruption. And then you can have these anti-corruption campaigns, which obviously is a very big issue in China at the moment, and which could take on either one of these forms. It could either be, and I think this is the big debate in China now, is the current anti-corruption campaign of Xi Jinping, to what degree this is basically a selective, this is something really targeted at rivals, and is not aimed at really, really rebuilding the state, making the state more effective, making government more effective, or whether or not it's going to go deeply enough that actually it will amount to some serious reform of the state and of governance, right? I think this is an open question at this point. But the point being, none of these things are things that are making China more democratic. But they might redefine the legitimacy of the CCP, or at least of Xi Jinping as a leader, in a way that, to the extent that he perceives there are signals of trouble, that there's protest, the economy might be softening a bit. If there are any signs of weakening support, this could be the way that you try to respond to that sense of decline or sense of weakening without actually doing democracy through strength, as happened in these other cases. Okay? So to wrap up. So we commonly hear that this region, that developmental Asia, is uniquely ill-suited for democratization. This is the Confucian world. Confucianism and democracy not go together. People value political stability. They don't value democracy. So this is sort of the common culturalist argument about, again, that usually that stylized view that like, oh, Asia doesn't have democracies, right? It's like, well, India, Japan, Korea, Taiwan. I mean, this is Asia, right? But in fact, we're arguing the opposite. In fact, this region, developmental Asia, is distinctly well-suited for democracy. Because the main reason people don't want democracy is not because they just think democracy is a bad thing in general or they don't value it. They don't want democracy because they think it's going to mean instability. That's not an Eastern thing. That's not a Western thing. That's a human thing. Westerners don't like democracy if it leads to violence, instability, and social breakdown either, right? So the key is how do you generate an expectation of stability, right? So in developmental Asia, this is the region, more than any other region in the world, that has actually built up the political institutions during authoritarian times that they actually can pursue democracy without destabilizing the country. So it's not uniquely ill-suited, it's uniquely well-suited for democracy because it can do democracy through strength. All right? Second point. So Asia's, this modal pathway of democracy through strength is in some ways actually more comparable to 19th century Europe than to other similarly young democracies. So we would think, well, So South Korea and the Philippines, for instance, democratized at about the same time as cases in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, so they must be kind of comparable to those. But in fact, it looks more like cases in Europe where parties, the state apparatus, the economy were built up over a long period of time, and those preceded the full-blown democratic concessions, or in the case of Europe, the universal suffrage. Okay, so in some ways, you old European, don't just look at contemporary cases. Think about historic Europe as another way to think about how democracy through strength happens. A third point is that authoritarian regimes, the institutions they build, the policies they pursue, they matter for more than just clinging to power. Okay? Basically, I think political scientists tend to say, well, whatever an authoritarian regime does, it's just because they're trying to cling to power. That's the only reason they do the things they do. It's not a bad starting assumption, but those things that they do have really major consequences, not just for their ability to stay in power, but for the long-term potential for a country to democratize in a way that is stabilizing or destabilizing. Okay, we can all think of plenty of cases where the introduction of democratic competition meant incredible instability, right? And those get drawn on as examples of why democracy means instability. Well, if it's those scenarios on the left, yeah, it often does, but on the right, it doesn't, okay? And so we have to look at what regimes are doing over the course of their lifetime to pave the way for democratic stability. So someone like Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, again, is seen as the great poster child of, see, look how well authoritarianism works. One could also look at Lee Kuan Yew and say, look at what an authoritarian ruler can do to build the institutions that pave the way for a stable democracy, right? And so one could think about it in that way as well, whether that's what's intended or not. So final point, kind of to wrap up. So democratization does not have to be a story of chaos and collapse in China or anywhere else in developmental Asia. It might be that outside of developmental Asia, it does in places with no institutions. Yeah, democratization looks like a mess, right? But if a regime concedes democracy before it seriously weakens, prospects for combining democracy and stability, which is what I think actually most people in the world would actually like, is to have democracy and stability, the prospects are actually quite excellent. All right? So I'll stop there. So thanks for taking the time.
We do have time for a couple of questions. If anyone has one, I see a hand up immediately and another one. We'll take a couple.
Also, I have my email address up here, so if people can't get questions in, I hope people will feel free to follow up.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, so the reason I'm using this microphone very closely is that you'll need to talk into the microphone when recording the speech. So I saw your hand up first, and then in a moment we'll take it to another question.
Great, thank you, Professor Slater. I am Feng. I'm going to UChicago to study in a few months, and I'm very excited. And thank you for your wonderful lecture. But I have a little question about democracy through strength. Is it possible that democracy through strength is hard to realize? Because usually during strong periods, the signals that you talked about to actually, make this authoritarian regimes or governments to realize that democracy should be processed, and oh wait, I lost. It's such a long sentence. So during this strong periods, is it possible that these signals that we talked about tend to be lesser and weaker? Because what we see in China, now that we have developed tremendously economically, and maybe people just have lesser reasons to go on the street and protest. Well, in 1989, it was a time of instability, and that's when people really want to give those signals, and that's when those signals are really strong.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think that so to the extent that a regime is quite strong, if that means that there's not a lot of protest, then they're not getting a signal of decline. And in fact, it's not in decline, right? That's actually, I mean, it's in fact probably an accurate signal that the regime has got some pretty serious strength. I mean, clearly China has a tremendous amount of protest, though. I mean, there's an unbelievable amount of contention and protest that's going on. It's just the character of that protest tends not to, it hasn't.
Not the kind of
yeah.
big
It's cellular. It's not cross-regional and the like. And it tends to be, at this point, the government is basically able to, a fire extinguisher of money, basically, right? And you can kind of say, okay, no, we'll put out the fire. And so the question would be, if that always worked in all times and places, then we would, I mean, it doesn't always work. So the question is, at what point does that stop working? At what point does, and does it become the case that these things start ramping up and becoming larger scale protests? And here, I think actually the environmental movement is really, really of interest. Because in places like South Korea and in Taiwan, it was largely, the environmental movement was one of the major sources of moving beyond, just very small scale local, land issues, non-payment of wages issues, to becoming much, much larger scale kind of thing. So I would think those are going to be watched very, very carefully. But for sure, when the regime is at its strongest, it will tend to not have the protests in the first place. And that's exactly when they will probably see almost no pressure to think about another way of doing things. So.
All right, let's take 2 more questions, I think. I'm going to go to one more student.
Yeah, great.
Hello, Professor Slater. My name is Harry, University of Chicago, class of 2019. And I want to ask you about the definition about democracy, because previously I thought that democracy means people electing for rivaling parties. But in your case of Malaysia and Singapore, actually people do vote, and the ruling party of Malaysia is losing quite a lot of vote.
Mm-hmm.
And why do you think that this is not a democracy? And how do you distinguish between democracy and quasi-democracy?
With my backup slide. So I don't know how many of you have read Andreas Schedler. I think this absolutely says quite beautifully the way I tend to think about where the boundary line is. So there's all this literature now about what's called hybrid regimes. So Malaysia's thinking about, well, they have democratic features, they have authoritarian features, so they're neither. Right? This is a very common way of thinking about it. Like, well, they're democrat-ish or something like that. So they've got something. And Schedler kind of explains why regimes that do authoritarian things are authoritarian regimes. That's the basic point. Okay, you don't undo your authoritarian practices and characteristics by then doing other things which look democratic. Okay, they negate, because they prevent fundamentally there being a level playing field. Right? An authoritarian regime, essentially authoritarian regimes bully their opponents. In a word, anyone wants to challenge their rule, run against them, criticize them, get bullied. But so conceptually, Schedler has this great discussion of this, right? Which is, okay, hybrid regimes. Well, here's what I think about hybrid regimes, right? So when you call something electoral authoritarian, Singapore and Malaysia are definitely electoral authoritarian regimes, in my opinion. Certainly electoral, right? And I'd say so. It transcends. It's not just a question of democratic quality. So we're not talking about the desirable attributes of high quality democracy. We're not saying, oh, Singapore and Malaysia are lacking these traits of high-quality democracy, right? So that's America. America has a terrible quality democracy in all kinds of ways. I could go on for days about why America is a low-quality democracy, okay? So that's not what's going on in Singapore and Malaysia. It's about what are the indispensable attributes of minimal democracy. Okay? And that, again, is you have to have a meaningfully level playing field. You have to treat your opponents the way you treat those who are within the same government. So Schedler argues, and I agree, so when these quote-unquote democratic deficits, right, if they cancel the democratic essence of electoral regimes, we should call the animal by its name, right, autocracy. So this next point I think is really good. So clinging to the notion of democracy, even if qualified by disqualifying adjectives, this is like, you call Singapore a quasi-democracy or a pseudo-democracy or a semi-democracy, right? So when you do that, what you do is you weaken your sense of authoritarian realities rather than sharpening your sense of democratic deficits. Right? So again, they do these authoritarian things. So Schedler concludes that these electoral autocracies, they are hybrid regimes. They do combine features of both, but they're hybrid authoritarian regimes. They're not unclassifiable regimes that are in this no man's land between democracy and authoritarianism. Right? So I think it's quite clear that where you violate these basic minimal procedural competitive, that you belong on the right side of the chart. Okay. So we could talk a lot more about Malaysia is a particularly interesting case in terms of the kind of change in tone and some people do perceive there's been some level of democratization there, but I think that's never been true in the last few months, where they've basically used the Sedition Act like never before against political opponents, has exposed the fact that it was never any real democratic agenda there at all.
All right, I think we'll take one more question. Professor Slater will be around during our reception, so feel free to ask him some questions at that time as well. And I saw you had an energetic hand up a moment ago.
Thank you. Changdong from Peking University. Okay, so actually I think you have partially answered my question, and so it's more like a comment.
Okay.
So I think there are like 3 stages. So the first stage is there's like one-party authoritarianism, and then somehow it transferred into a dominant party system, which you can call like a hybrid regime or something, competitive authoritarianism. And then the third stage will be there's a democracy, or in terms of party systems, like a 2-party system or multi-party system. And for me, I think the democratization process maybe is like, I mean, it depends how you define it, right? So you mentioned it like the transformation from first step to the second step is democratization.
Yeah.
But if we define it as the transformation from the second to the third, then what I can see is, I mean, in many cases, especially in Taiwan, maybe also in Japan, I think we see there's elites dividend for the dominant party to lose power and evolve into a 2-party or multi-party system.
So you think, I mean, in terms of O'Donnell and Schmitter, the argument about that you still need this ruler division to get a political regime change.
I mean, still it's like a powerful alternative argument, and maybe it still works in your argument.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible that, I mean, elites are never of all one mind. There's never total consensus, right? So one could say something like, well, when Chiang Ching-kuo, said we're gonna, he did say it's the end of an era. That, I mean, there might have been people in the party who were unhappy about it, and there might have been more conflict within the party. But the fact of the matter is that when you democratize through strength, the point is that it doesn't itself split the party, okay? And that might be the best way to think about it, is what happens on the tail end of it. So in a case like Indonesia, so here's the puzzle. So Suharto is the military dictator. He's like Marcos. He gets overthrown. He's weak. Economic crisis, he gets chased out the door. Okay, but that's not democracy. That's just the collapse of a dictator. So if you think about Egypt, like Mubarak falls, that doesn't give you democracy. It just means you don't have Mubarak anymore. The question is, so someone's got to put the reforms in. Someone has to say, like, okay, now we need a new party law. We need a new media law. We need to actually release political prisoners. We're going to dismantle this intelligence apparatus, like these kinds of things. And that falls to B.J. Habibie, his successor, okay, who is an incredibly weak leader, right? He's in a very weak position. He's utterly unpopular. He has no political base. He was made vice president precisely because he was so unpopular. Okay, so you say, oh, well, this is, So what does he do? He says, no, we're gonna do all these democratic reforms, and we're gonna do democratic elections. We're gonna speed them up. We're gonna do them sooner rather than later. And here's the point: everybody in Golkar, everybody in the ruling party supports him. Everybody goes along with it. Why? Because they think they're gonna do all right. They're like, this gives us a chance to get a fresh lease on life and get out of the old days when we were seen as, Suharto's lackeys. And this was, so if he didn't have support in the party, they would have just toppled him in a second. He could have been just toppled in no time whatsoever. So the point was, there was, to a surprising degree, unity within the dominant party about pursuing these really serious and quick democratic reforms in 1999, which I don't think really fits with a vision of what was the divisions within the elite that caused democracy per se. Divisions did, and here it might be the point that we're distinguishing the fall of an authoritarian regime from the building of democracy, right? Because it is certainly true that the Suharto regime collapsed because of the fragmentation and divisions within the regime. But the reason that you get democracy through strength is very much because of the way the party unified behind that as being the way forward. And they weren't trying to give up power. They were trying to win under new conditions.
All right, Professor Slater, thanks so much. I'm going to hand the mic over to Paul Wong again.
Oh, sure. Actually, I'm going to have a question later on.
All right.
Yeah, I forgot to ask. But Well, thank you very much for this wonderful lecture. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
I learned a lot. And next week, I believe, on May 16th, we do have another activity. Here, the Alumni Club has a co-sponsor activity with Cambridge Alumni Club here. So welcome you all to attend on May 16th. Again, thank you very much, Professor Slater.
Thank you.